It's setting it up. It'll take about 30 seconds. So if everyone could mute.
Great. It even says live on Facebook on my Zoom screen. That's so cool.
And there we are. We're live.
All right. Well, I'll take over. Hello, Chamber Choir of Grand Rapids, and hello, anybody who might be with us on Facebook Live. We're so excited that you're with us. I'm Kody Wallace. I'm the Artistic Director of the Chamber Choir of Grand Rapids. And throughout the winter and early spring, in an effort for us to stay connected, but also to stay connected throughout our community and to share music in a meaningful way through a digital space, we're going to take a look at some different masterworks in the choral literature and have a chance to talk about the masterworks and listen. And you'll also find, if you're in the Zoom chat with the Chamber Choir of Grand Rapids, that the score is in the chat. And if you're following us on Facebook, in the Facebook event that you can find on the Chamber Choir of Grand Rapids Facebook event, I posted a link to a public domain copy of today's piece that we're going to talk about. I attended my first lecture style recital at the Proms in London when I was studying abroad as part of my master's program, and got to see an informative little chat where somebody talked about a piece of music and then got to see the live performance. Since we're not quite in a live performance stage of the COVID-19 pandemic right now, I'm going to share a little bit about the piece that we're looking at today, which is Haydn's Kleine Orgelmesse, and we'll all watch that recording together. And I'd invite any of you that are interested to sing along using the score that we put online through the PDF. I am going to do what everyone on Zoom that's leading a meeting does, which is I'm going to say out loud, I'm going to share my screen now. And I'm going to share a little PowerPoint that I put together, and hopefully we can talk a little bit about this piece. And then we'll take a listen and sing together. So let me find that button. And you all are bearing with me so well. That's my Google Drive. You don't need that. So there are a couple names that the piece we're going to talk about today goes by. The title that Haydn gave it was the Missa Brevis Sancti Joannis de Deo, which was to honor that the brothers hospitaliers of Eisenstadt, their patron saint was Saint John of God. It's also really commonly known as the Kleine Orgelmesse, which is something we'll look at. But we're going to go through and talk a little bit about Franz Joseph Haydn, hopefully talk about some things that you might not have known before today, take a look at some of the unique features of this piece. And then we're going to listen to a recording of it together, and I know I'll be singing on mute, and I hope that you will also sing along. So Franz Joseph Haydn was born in Rohrau, Austria. There's a little dot from my Google Maps page earlier that I screenshotted. And what's kind of important to know is that he's not in a big city center like Vienna. He's actually really close to the border of Hungary, Slovakia, and Austria, what that is in the modern day. And so he grew up in a very diverse place. He heard multiple languages in the town where he grew up. His brother, Michael Haydn, was also, you might especially know his music from the church, was also a composer, ended up being a Kapellmeister in Salzburg. His father and grandfather were wheelwrights. So unlike some other really famous composers you might know of, like Mozart, whose father, Leopold, was a musician and wrote a really famous treatise on string playing, and Johann Sebastian Bach, who came from a huge family of all professional musicians. Franz Joseph Haydn and his brothers Michael and John the Evangelist were both born into a family that liked music and performed music, but weren't necessarily professional musicians. His father also served as the magistrate, sort of like a village mayor of the town of Rohrau where he grew up. And his mother, Anna Maria, was a cook at the castle in that seat before they got married. Haydn is now really well known and venerated as one of the three Viennese classics, Mozart, Haydn, and Beethoven. When he was alive, his vocal works, and especially his masses, were as famous as his instrumental works, but right after his death, his symphonies and his string quartets were really what had a lot of popularity. In modern listenings now, we do still have a lot of his large masses from his later time at the Esterhazy Castle, but his brother Michael provided a lot more liturgical music and smaller works for chorus. He's familiarly called the father of the modern symphony, although he probably would be just as well known as the father of the modern string quartet, because he was a master of form and he was a master of structure. And so the way that the symphony would go on to be structured throughout the classical period, where it reached sort of one of its major peaks on the stage, he was a big part of how that was organized structurally. And immediately after his death, he was really known for his commitment to form and his wit, because his music was so structurally intact. But as his music endured throughout generations, he was not only seen as really a master of form and structure, but also had this depth of feeling, this turn of phrase, and this musical genius that set him apart as somebody who is both structurally really well sound and also musically really well sound. Again, not a musical family in the sense of a Mozart or a Bach, but his father, he described his father as a great lover of music, and he played the harp without reading a note of music. And his mother had a beautiful singing voice, and she sang in the church where they grew up and also at home. The three Haydn brothers, Franz, Joseph, Johann Michael, and Johann Evangelist, were all professional musicians. Michael stayed in the church and became the Kapellmeister and the concertmaster in Salzburg, and taught Carl Maria von Weber and Anton Diabelli. And Johann Evangelist, although he's known as a professional musician, actually ended up as the tenor soloist in Eisenstadt with his brother Joseph, who was the composer in residence. And we know of at least one account in which Johann was fired and then rehired only at the behest of his brother. And so it seems that Salieri, who's a name you may know if you watched the really famous Mozart biopic Amadeus, described the singing of Johann Evangelist as nasal and not pleasing to listen to. So we're not sure now how great of a musician he was, but he at least had a home and a job at his brother's church. And the Haydn parents organized a lot of concerts among their neighbors, and so their house seemed to be, with their father being the mayor of the town and them being a very musical family, it seemed to be a place that people would gather in around, and all the boys and everyone in the family was very musical and would put on shows for the neighbors. Franz Joseph learned his father's compositions really early, and in old age and on his deathbed claimed to still know the melodies that his father had written. So his father and his father's musical capacity had a big impact on him. He was singing at the church and playing the harpsichord and violin by the age of 6. And even before he turned 10, a cousin to his father, Matthias Haydn, Matthias Frank, who lived nearby, heard Joseph sing and invited Joseph to live with him. Matthias Frank was he was a school principal and also a musician, and so Joseph got some of his early musical training there. Haydn was known as an early prodigy. This is the church where he grew up, and by 8 he was recruited to serve as a choir boy in Vienna. So this is the St. Stephen's Church in Vienna, where he and his brother both sang. And he received some more advanced training in singing harpsichord and violin there. And he later grew up and taught his older brother, and another pretty important composer in that time, Johann Albrechtsberger, was there. So it was a church where a lot was going on musically. He remained at Stevensdom, rehearsing and singing in performances as he grew before his voice broke. And he even started teaching some lessons. His younger brother joined him in 1945. But eventually, when Haydn's voice finally, in the church choir tradition, they call it his voice breaking, when his voice changed, he left that and began just teaching music in Vienna. It was not a time of Haydn's life that he wrote about particularly fondly. He was eventually able to study with Nicola Porpora as he was stopping through Vienna, and that got him sort of some more widespread recognition around Vienna, which led to his patronage with the Esterházys, which is really where he grew into his most productive and fruitful musically. At this time period, for a professional musician, finding a patron was, at least as a career move, a really important thing to do. And so at this time, after he leaves St. Stephen's Church and starts teaching, he works his way into this classical patronage system. He first comes to the Esterházys with Prince Paul Anton, and that's in 1761, and Haydn would have worn a livery and been pretty high up in a very famous family. If you ever watched any of the shows that I'm trying to think of the British show where they all wear their liveries. He was engaged in a family that was very high up at this time period, and they built a huge palace in rural Hungary where Haydn would compose, direct the orchestra, arrange some chamber music, and later on in his career, as the Esterházys continued to up their commitment to the musical life of their court, they staged full operas. And if you trace through Haydn writes several masses, the orchestration gets bigger and bigger and bigger as the Esterházy family invests in getting a larger orchestra. And this arrangement was really great for Haydn because the Esterházy princes had a deep affinity for music. They were really willing to invest in Haydn. They let him see the orchestra every day. And by being insulated from Vienna, he didn't necessarily need to worry as much about what a reviewer might think of his music. And so because of this, he has a little bit more freedom to be experimental as a composer, as opposed to always worrying about, what other people might think about his music. He was really the only game in town at the Esterházy palace. The Mass that we're going to look at today was written in 1774 for the Brother Hospitaliers. It's an order of monks, and their patron saint was St. John of God. The hospital chapel in Eisenstadt, Austria, was the site for the premiere performance, and Haydn actually played the organ in that performance. The length of the Mass, which we'll see when we sing it, it's less than 20 minutes long, and the small forces were all because this Mass wouldn't have been premiered at the huge Esterházy palace, but instead was performed just at the chapel that they had there at the church, at the hospital. And so, known colloquially as the Kleine Orgelmesse, this piece there was another Mass written earlier, which is known as the Large Organ Mass. This is known as the Small Organ Mass, and it's unclear as to whether it's called that because it's a smaller Mass, a Missa Brevis, or because the organ that Haydn would have played on originally was a really small organ just in the chapel attached to the hospital. The performing forces of the original performance were just known as the Vienna Church Trio, which were 2 violins, 1 string bass, and an organ. So even in this time period, for those of you that are music ministers, even in this time period, the typical church didn't have the money to have a full orchestra. So this was written for a smaller ensemble of forces. You can see here that it has the full Kyrie, Gloria, Credo, Sanctus, Benedictus, and Agnus Dei. And the Sanctus comes with Benedictus, and it was, the Benedictus had an organ solo, which was common practice in this time period in Vienna. But it actually is a Missa Brevis, or known as a short Mass, because of something called telescoping text. So you can see, it may be hard to see in your screen, but this is the intro of the Gloria and the intro of the Credo. And here you can see that each voice is actually singing a different bit of text. As the Gloria opens, the basses sing Et in terra pax hominibus, the tenors Dominus Deus agnus Dei, the altos Domine Filii unigenite, and the sopranos Gratias agimus tibi. And the reason is that there's just so much text going on in the Gloria and Credo that in order for the Mass to stay at a short length, each voice had to sing overlapping bits of text. And when Haydn was writing this for the Hospital Brothers, they may have been called into another room to perform a medical procedure at any time. And so for this specific commission, Haydn needed to keep the Mass short so that they could actually stay for a full Mass while still adhering to their duties as hospital workers of the time. Just some trivia about this work. At the time that this premiered, his brother, Michael Haydn, was a concertmaster in Salzburg, a much larger musical center. But the Salzburg church did not consider this telescoped text to be appropriate. So he actually rewrote the Gloria of his brother Franz Joseph's Mass, and it was almost 4 times longer. I think the original is about 31 measures. And when Michael writes it, instead of allowing each of the voices to sing bits of text at the same time, he sets all of the text separately for the whole chorus. And so it ends up being almost 120 measures. Some later versions after the premiere included larger forces. So there's evidence that this piece might have been performed at larger churches with trumpets, timpani, and clarinets. Johann Albrechtsberger, a really important composer this time that went to the same school, the St. Stephen's Choir Boy Church, with actually with Franz Joseph's little brother Michael. He was a friend of Haydn and Mozart and a teacher of Beethoven's, wrote an alternate little Benedictus for this that was different than what we'll hear today, which is the organ solo with soprano. And Haydn writes 13 masses. Some of the later ones that are really popular are the Mass in Time of War, or the Pauken Messe, the Nelson Mass. And this comes in as number 7 of those 13 masses, and one of the last before the major masses written at the end of Haydn's career. And just some interesting facts. Haydn and Beethoven had a really interesting relationship. So it's written about a lot, and I think the relationship between certain composers like Mozart and Salieri and Beethoven and Haydn, and there is also a relationship that exists between somebody like Johannes Brahms and Clara Schumann. Sometimes history likes to remember them as soap operas, and so they get a little bit spicier than they are in real life. But Beethoven took some lessons from Haydn around 1790. Haydn took some major trips to London and wrote a collection of London symphonies that are really become some of the more famous works that he writes. And Beethoven almost immediately believes that Haydn was jealous of him. Beethoven was much younger at the time, and he even begins taking secret lessons with another teacher, and unbeknownst to Haydn at the time. Haydn suggests for Beethoven's Opus 1, which is a set of piano trios, that he includes a student of Joseph Haydn. It seems that Haydn had the best of intentions, that he thought that if Beethoven wrote that he was a student of Franz Joseph Haydn, who was already a really well-established composer, that Beethoven might have a better chance of getting the works published by a major publishing house and performed by a lot of other people. But at the performance of the trios, Beethoven rushes over to Haydn to see what he thinks, and Haydn thinks that they need some serious reworking. So this, in combination with Beethoven's thinking that Haydn might be jealous of him, and Beethoven's pretty complicated attitude towards nobility and the idea of needing patronage to make it as a performer, make Haydn and Beethoven's relationship toward the end of Haydn's life pretty complicated. And these individual instances are often overwritten a lot to make this kind of struggle between the two of them seem bigger than it really was. In their worst moments, Beethoven claimed that he'd never learned anything from Haydn, and Haydn called Beethoven one of the heights of insult, an atheist. And so as Beethoven gets a little bit older, he grows fonder of Haydn, grows fonder of Haydn's music. And at Haydn's funeral, there are accounts that say that Beethoven knelt before Haydn and kissed his hand and called Haydn the equal of Mozart and Bach. So the story has a happy ending, either way you see it. Haydn and Beethoven end up in a good place, and Haydn and Mozart are also pretty close throughout this time period. So they're all, interestingly, big players around the same time in Austria. And so now we get to the point where I'm going to invite you to get a look at your copy of the score. Since I shared my screen, your Zoom call or your Facebook Live may have gone full screen. If you hit escape, you should be able to get out of that full screen mode so you can access the score. And you can either watch along with us or you can sing along on mute. I'll be singing along with my bass part. And I'm going to mute myself so you won't hear me singing, but you should still be able to hear the music on my screen. So let me see if I can make this fuller. That starts pretty soon, so I'm going to go ahead back to the beginning. It doesn't look like I can make it full screen, but let's go ahead and listen through and sing together. This is me clapping for all of you that sang along with me. It's been a while since I've had the chance to use my voice or wave my arms at a live concert, but being virtual here with my friends and family in the Chamber Choir of Grand Rapids and all of you joining us on Facebook, it was wonderful to make some music together. If you liked this piece and you haven't heard a lot of Haydn's music, some other things you might want to check out. He wrote over 100 symphonies. Number 94 is called a Surprise Symphony, is a really popular one. He wrote, we talked about 13 masses, but the later masses, especially some of my favorite are the Pauken Messa, the Lord Nelson Mass, the Mass in Time of War, are really some of the height of what music has done. He wrote 2 major oratorios. We talked about him going to London and he saw some of Handel's oratorios, and he wrote Creation and then the Seasons. And he's also really well known for his string quartets, especially Opus 76, and then I especially like the Russian quartets, Opus 33. So I've exited my screen sharing mode. In a time where we found in the chamber choir that we're hungry for connection and for music, this is one of the ways in which we're trying to engage each other and also to engage our community at large and through Facebook, the world at large, and in sharing music and singing together and learning about a new piece. And we at the chamber choir, before these chats go live, have a little time to catch up and talk to each other. If you're interested, you can find all of our information online at Chamber Choir of Grand Rapids. If you're in the greater Grand Rapids area and are looking for a choir to sing in, we'd love for you to check us out. And we hope you'll catch up with us and like us on Facebook. Next month, we're going to take a look at one of Beethoven's masses. His Missa Solemnis is really well known, but he also has a mass in C that's beautiful, that's not played and sung enough. So next month, we'll take a look at Beethoven's Mass in C and do a similar thing. We'll talk a little bit about Beethoven, talk a little bit about the piece. I'll get out a public domain copy of the score. We'll all sing together, and those of us that are in the chamber choir will gather early for a little bit of fellowship. So thank you so much for joining us. We hope you enjoyed, and hopefully we'll see you next month.
Bye, everybody.